Okay, listen. What if I somehow traveled backwards in time and I accidentally distracted my grandma from ever meeting my grandpa? Because then my dad wouldn't be born, right? And then I wouldn't even exist. A lot of us like to joke that if we had the ability to travel backwards in time, we'd be scared that a minor action we took then could massively impact our current lives. But we neglect to see that minor actions we take today could have a massive impact on the future. This idea of the butterfly effect works both positively and negatively. If we make small changes, they'll add up over time to benefit the future. But if we continue making poor decisions, their effects will snowball, ultimately causing our downfall. One example of the butterfly effect can be seen in the topic of climate change. Now, everybody already knows climate change is a problem, so why is nobody acting on it? We are constantly inundated with facts and statistics that don't motivate us to change very much. But by understanding the psychology behind our own actions, or lack thereof, we can be better motivated to make significant changes in our own lives by enforcing communities that normalize caring about climate change and supporting policies that directly fight the problems. The first problem and the first reason why we don't act in the face of climate change is that we don't view climate change itself as a real threat. The climatechat.org, a website guiding a larger discussion on the topic of climate change, has come up with the acronym PAIN to explain why. The P stands for personal. We tend to play this blame game, pinning problems on a particular person or group of people, when in reality, climate change isn't the direct result of a specific person. We are all responsible for the future of our Earth. The A stands for abrupt. We notice changes that happen abruptly, and climate change is more of a gradual threat, so it doesn't really set off the alarm bells in our heads. Even so, a study by F.C. Moore, assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis, found that we are actually growing accustomed to climate change, implying that we are even less likely to act the longer it goes on. The I stands for immoral. We share articles and videos that make us feel angry or sad, but climate change just doesn't evoke these emotions to the extent where we can truly grasp how terrible its effects are. Sure, polar bears are losing their habitats and biodiversity is decreasing, but what does that mean for humans? Regulations are being cut under the Trump administration, but what effect does that really have on our everyday lives? Even though some natural disasters linked to climate change have directly affected people, like Hurricane Katrina, a study by Howe in 2019 found that these events don't cause people's opinions of climate change to shift very much in the long term. The N stands for now, which is kind of similar to the A for abrupt. Let's start this one off with an example. We're all aware that average temperatures across the globe are hitting record highs. In Antarctica in February of this year, scientists reported the highest recorded temperature on the continent, 64.9 degrees Fahrenheit. That was warmer than Los Angeles on the same day. So we all know that, global temperatures are following an upward trend, but it's not like we receive government push notifications on our phones telling us the weather tomorrow is going to be 120 degrees, so we gotta act fast. No, climate change is just happening too gradually. We don't perceive the temperature increases, let alone all the other effects of climate change, as a real threat to our everyday lives. We aren't seeing the devastating impacts right now, and so it's hard for us to process why we should change our behavior. And even if we did receive government push notifications telling us the weather was going to be 120 degrees, it's not guaranteed that everybody would act. You've probably seen on the news people refusing to evacuate their homes even in the midst of a massive hurricane. In a Time article in 2018, Jeffrey Kluger states that humans have evolved to care more about immediate threats than those in the future. And so it's hard for us to wrap our heads around why we should make sacrifices now, like evacuating our homes, even if this will help prevent future disasters. Now, even if climate change did follow the acronym of PAIN, even if it were personal, abrupt, immoral, and happening now, there are still psychological barriers preventing us from changing our behavior. It's no secret that humans are primarily self-centered animals, since this increased our ancestors' chances of survival. As a result, humans have a region of our brains called the medial prefrontal cortex, or the MPFC, that has to do with regulating self-centered emotions and behavior. If you went under an MRI and I asked you to think about yourself, your MPFC would light up with activity. A similar thing happens if I ask you to think about a close friend or a family member, although to a lesser extent. But if I ask you to think about a random stranger, like residents of a small town in Ohio, your MPFC would barely light up at all. Now here's the interesting bit. According to a study by behavioral neuroscientist Darjanbo in 2009, when you think about your future self, 5 or 10 years into the future, your MPFC doesn't really light up at all. We don't recognize our future selves as ourselves. So our usual self-centered behavior in wanting to protect our own interests and our chances of survival doesn't really kick in for our future selves. And this way of thinking is significant when the threat to our survival is climate change. So now that we understand the processes behind why we are so slow to act, we can discuss 2 powerful yet realistic solutions. These solutions are centered around a group mentality rather than the individual, because in this way we can overcome the individual's psychological barriers and instead work towards change as part of a group. The first solution is enforcing communities that normalize caring about climate change. We all exist as parts of communities, whether it's our friends, our classmates, our schools, our workplaces, the Bay Area, California, and the entire United States. And we are also part of online communities that might bridge continents. A study by Jackson in 2008 says that we are more likely to work towards a goal if we are part of a tight-knit community or a group of friends working towards the same goal. We can utilize this idea of group mentality to our advantage by holding fundraisers in clubs at school, participating in events like Bike to Work days, and bringing food to book club meetings or family reunions in reusable containers rather than plastic. And when we normalize and encourage this type of behavior, people feel peer pressured in a good way to fit in. Going back to the idea of the butterfly effect, when we make small contributions, they will add up across communities and over time. The second solution is supporting policies that directly fight the problems. Many of you have probably heard that global warming is largely due to big corporations for using tons of carbon dioxide and releasing it into the air, or using unnecessary amounts of water. And while this is true, it doesn't mean that, well, citizens' actions are completely useless if companies are doing all this terrible stuff anyways. Instead, it means that we need to be fighting back and pushing Congress to support policies that regulate energy and water usage. Greta Thunberg is at the forefront of climate strikes and rallies across the globe. And while these help serve as a public image of unity against a common threat, you don't need to participate in a strike to have an impact. Multiple websites like the Environmental Defense Fund at edf.org offer specific petitions that you can sign and ways to contact your local representatives. Now, let's take a step back for a second to put all of this into perspective. If we each do our part in the fight against climate change by enforcing it in our individual communities and supporting policies that regulate corporations, we just might be able to subvert a slow and painful death for thousands and thousands of species. You may never get the opportunity to travel backwards in time to accidentally distract Grandma from ever meeting Grandpa, but you do have the opportunity to shift the entire fate of our planet. In the words of Ernest Hemingway, the Earth is a fine place and worth fighting for, and the power to do so is in your hands. Thank you.